Kirsten is a writer, a folklorist, a museum consultant, and a lecturer whose work focuses on race, art, history, and politics. And William is the Samuel Du Bois Cook Professor of Public Policy at Duke University. And based upon what I've seen, I would describe them as partners in justice who should be recognized as the foremost experts on reparations for Black Americans. Kirsten and William they got their own program, they got their own run of show. So I'm gonna let them do their thing. I'm gonna turn my camera off for a moment. I may pop in and out and ask some questions, but I'm gonna let them do their thing. So thank you all for being here. And Kirsten and William, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Langston. We are so appreciative of this invitation and the opportunity to speak with you and to the audience that you have convened, across the country and perhaps the world. So we were asked to talk a little bit about our origin stories and about the origins of the book From Here to Equality. And we both grew up in families that I would describe as race families. We used to joke in my household that race was a member of the family. It was talked about every day, almost at every meal. I grew up in segregated Texas, Fort Worth to be specific. My life changed dramatically in third grade when my mother put me in a majority white parochial school. But we lived in a Black community, segregated Black community. This was a time when in Texas, there was work for Black people, but you did not have the kind of integration, the kind of influence, the kind of authority that Blacks had even in, the North or even other Southern cities. And, my mother was very active politically. My grandparents were very active. My grandfather was a minister. He was a lifelong NAACP member. Was very determined that his congregation become members of the NAACP, that they not just talk, but that they act on their values and their convictions. And that's something that I grew up with. I also was very aware when I began to go to this majority white school and was invited into the homes of some of my white classmates, that there was this tremendous difference in terms of the sort of material, what do you call that? Just just the kind of lives that they were living, the material stuff of their lives. And, I came from a working, I used to say sort of upper lower class community, but these are hardworking folks, who had 2 and 3 jobs, my mother included. And so I knew that it wasn't a case of the Black people I knew not working hard. It was not a case of their not being smart. It wasn't a case that they were spending their money unwisely. But there was something fundamentally wrong. And I can remember bringing those questions to the table, to the dinner table at my household. So, and then when our first child was born, my grandfather on my father's side said something to me that didn't really strike me at the time. When we presented our infant, his great grandson, he said, he pronounced him the 5th generation. And I didn't quite, understand what he meant. And I didn't ask him at the time what he meant, but what he was referring to was the fact that he was part of the 5th generation born after slavery. And so on my father's side, I am the 4th generation, but on my mother's side, I'm actually the 3rd. My maternal grandmother, Harriet Talia Farrell Mitchell, is the daughter, or was, she's now deceased, but she was the daughter of someone who was born enslaved. And my children knew her, into their adulthood. So if you're looking at slavery from a generational vantage point, slavery was not that far, not that long ago in my family. My grandmother knew her father. She grew up with him. And so it was not a mystery to her, knowing someone who had been born enslaved.
And in my family, on my mother's side, my great grandmother was the daughter of two people who had been enslaved on Rose Hill Plantation in North Carolina, and I knew her. I think I was about 8 or 9 years of age when she finally passed. But I had had the opportunity to spend a lot of time with her in Wilson, North Carolina, particularly sitting on my grandmother's porch. From that standpoint, I was the fourth generation from slavery, and our son's the fifth. And I'm pretty much convinced that that's also the case on my father's side of the family, although there's some uncertainty about whether or not my great grandparents were enslaved or whether it was my great great grandparents. That's something that we haven't completely determined, but I know on my mother's side that I'm the fourth generation from slavery. So I think that's been important in terms of the way in which Kirsten and I have thought about this project. I'd like to give you a more accurate story about the evolution of the book, though. The first edition of From Here to Equality was published in 2020. And the second edition just last year, the paperback edition that includes a new preface. But we had been working on the book for a decade before it was finally published. And that's a story unto itself. I think what we basically completely revised, revamped a couple of versions of the manuscript before we were satisfied. But the ideas in the book are present in a number of things that we wrote prior to that. And one example is the criterion for eligibility, or the criteria for eligibility, which are laid out explicitly in a paper that was published in 2003 in the American Economic Association's proceedings. And so, I think that the ideas that we develop in the book are definitely present in materials that we had written before then.
Pay attention to your efforts as the writer of the introduction of a collection of essays on reparations.
Yeah, so in 1989, Richard America, and that's really his name, Richard America asked me to write the preface to a book that he was editing called The Wealth of Races. And this was a collection of essays by economists who were attempting to calculate how much reparations should be paid to the descendants of the enslaved. And my reaction at the time, I was a reparations skeptic. And so my reaction at the time was, well, Richard, this is never going to happen. Why are we investing our time in doing this? It's a waste of time. And Richard said, if you want to say that after you read the materials, if you want to say that in your introductory essay, feel free to do so. So I think he was somewhat prescient, and he knew something about what my reaction would be. And once I started reading the essays, I became so convinced that this was something that was the right thing to do, that it was really the only way to really alter the conditions that are faced by living Black American descendants of persons enslaved in the United States, that even if the odds were extremely long, it was something that we would have to work towards and do. And so I think my first major piece personally on reparations was the introduction to the volume that Richard America produced. And then I guess you and I did a paper together, an op-ed at one point for the Root. That's what, maybe 2008 at the latest. Yeah. So I'd say there's a window of about 30 years where the two of us have been thinking about and working on these issues and publishing material about it.
So maybe we'll sort of pivot, to the formal
presentation.
Okay. So maybe if you will.
Yeah. Okay. So So Langston, you mentioned when we were talking before we came on, you mentioned the effects of the pandemic, not only in creating your program, but also in altering the amount of time that people devote to podcasts, their attentiveness, their interest in these kinds of issues. And when our book came out in 2020, it coincided with the formal or official onset of the pandemic. We're convinced that the disease was present in the United States, at least by the latter part of 2019. But we were also then compelled to think about the relationship between COVID-19 and the arguments for reparations. And so briefly, we're going to start our discussion this evening with a focus on the sets of arguments that have been raised in opposition to reparations. But I also want to emphasize that the relationship between reparations and COVID-19 is something that we have to pay close attention to. Excess COVID-19 Black mortality for us reinforced the importance of reparations. We did an opinion piece for the Philadelphia Inquirer that was published in April 20th, 2020. And in that piece, we reported that in North Carolina, Blacks were 22% of the state's population, but 32% of the confirmed cases of COVID-19 and 37% of the deaths from COVID-19. In Mecklenburg County, the county that includes Charlotte, North Carolina, Blacks constituted about 31% of the population at that time, but 44% of the cases of COVID-19 and half of the deaths from COVID-19. In the state of Louisiana, where Black Americans made up about 33% of the population, 70% of the confirmed deaths, more than twice as many people in the population proportionately were Black. So excess mortality was attributable to Blacks being over-concentrated in occupations with high degrees of exposure to the virus, attributable to Blacks having a disproportionately high number of pre-existing conditions as a residue, a vicious residue of racial inequality in the United States. And these would include asthma, diabetes, and hypertension. Although we argue that the fundamental pre-existing condition is a resources gap, which is best captured by the Black-white wealth differential, wealth inequality. Blacks represent Black American descendants of US slavery represent about 12% of the population, but possess less than 2% of the nation's wealth. And that results in a gap of about $840,000 in difference in net worth between the average Black and white household.
So we'd like to read some from Here to Equality, to kind of frame, the argument that we're making, and also to kind of help all of us get on the same page to have this conversation together. So we say the following: From Here to Equality draws a thick line from the nation's origins to the present. The case we build in this volume is based on all three tiers or phases of injustice: slavery, American apartheid or Jim Crow, and the combined effects of present-day discrimination and the ongoing deprecation of Black lives. Most advocates of Black reparations have focused exclusively on the injustices of slavery as the basis for redress. Law professor Boris Bittker argued that the case for Black reparations should center solely on the harms of legalized segregation, while Roy L. Brooks, also a legal scholar, has argued that the foundation for Black reparations is, quote, the legacy of slavery and Jim Crow, end quote. We submit that the bill of particulars for Black reparations also must include contemporary ongoing injustices, So these are injustices resulting in barriers and penalties for the Black descendants of persons enslaved in the United States. Sociologist Joe Fagan catalogs the conflicting injuries on Black Americans, including wage penalties, physical and psycho-emotional health wounds, and community and institutional damages. Despite the Brown v. Board of Education decision in 1954, a wave of federal legislation in the 1960s and 1970s intended to eliminate legal apartheid in the United States and the enactment of anti-discrimination laws, Blacks continue to bear the weight of American racism. That burden is manifest in labor market discrimination, grossly attenuated wealth, confinement to neighborhoods with lower levels of amenities and safety, disproportionate exposure to inferior schooling, significantly greater danger in encounters with the police and the criminal justice system writ large, and a general social disdain for the value of Black people's lives. The legal apparatus created by the Civil Rights Revolution does little to address the complex web of harms imposed upon Black Americans today. Taken individually, any one of these three tiers of injustice, slavery, the regime of legal segregation and subordination, and current discrimination, makes a powerful case for Black reparations. Taken collectively, they are impossible to ignore.
In our book, we attempt to offer a conceptual definition of reparations, and I'd like to share a passage from the book in which we elaborate on what reparations should mean in general. And then we talk about its application to the specific case of Black American descendants of U.S. slavery. So we say the following: reparations are a program of acknowledgement, redress, and closure for a grievous injustice. Where African Americans are concerned, the grievous injustices that make the case for reparations include slavery, legal segregation or Jim Crow, and ongoing discrimination and stigmatization. ARC, A-R-C, the acronym that stands for Acknowledgement, Redress, and Closure, characterizes the three essential elements of the reparations program that we are advocating. Acknowledgement, redress, and closure are components of any effective reparations project. Acknowledgement involves recognition and admission of the wrongs by the perpetrators or beneficiaries of the injustice. For African Americans, this means the receipt of a formal apology and a commitment for redress on the part of the American people as a whole, to be represented in principle by the national government. A national act of declaration that a great wrong has been committed, but beyond an apology, acknowledgement requires those who benefited from the exercise of the atrocities to recognize the advantages they gained and commit themselves to the cause of redress. Now, redress is the second component of our concept of reparations, and this involves restitution for the damages that have been incurred by the victimized community. And this would mean, in the context of Black American descendants of U.S. slavery, that the federal government would make a concerted effort to eliminate the racial wealth differential in the United States. Now, we mentioned a moment ago that comes to approximately $840,000 per household. Collectively, this would require an expenditure in excess of $14 trillion by the federal government. And we argue that that's the minimum amount that redress should take. It's similar to the way in which redress has been conducted for other victimized communities. That is to say, a direct payment to the eligible recipients, whether we're talking about the reparations plan that was provided for Japanese Americans who were subjected to unjust incarceration during the course of World War II, or the German government's payments to victims of the Holocaust. Now, the third component, closure, involves an agreement on the part of the culpable party, in this case, the United States government, and the Black American population that would be eligible for reparations, that the debt has been paid satisfactorily. And so at that point, the account would be settled, and Black Americans would proceed to not make any further claims on the United States government for compensation unless there is a renewal of the atrocities or new types of atrocities are directed against that community.
So we want to talk a bit briefly about some of the claims that people make, in opposition to reparations. And one of those that we hear frequently is, well, first of all, just this whole concept, this whole question, this notion of slavery reparations. As we've said, we're not talking simply about slavery. Slavery is the whole from which everything, it's the, which everything's the catalyst from which everything sprung. But we're talking not just about slavery, but also about, 100 years, nearly 100 years of legal segregation and white terror campaigns, and also about, all of the injustices, all the atrocities and harms that are still happening today. It's not as if we've ever reached a point where those kinds of atrocities ceased.
Mm-hmm. And in fact, in the second edition, we had used the language reconciliation, and we changed it in the second edition to conciliation.
Exactly.
Because there was never any previous moment of conciliation between blacks and whites in the United States.
We're talking about the fact that Black people have never been fully admitted as citizens in this country. And that is something that could have happened at the end of the Civil War, at the point of emancipation, but it did not. And it actually has not happened to this day. But another point of opposition that I'd like to discuss briefly, we hear, people say, well, why didn't white America or America in general, or didn't white America or white America in general already pay its debt for slavery in blood by waging the Civil War, which resulted in emancipation? Some of you may be aware that, then House GOP conference chair Mike Pence said, this was in 2009, I don't believe there should be reparations. Then he identifies himself as a student of American history and asserts that, quote, reparations were paid in the lives of 600,000 Americans who fell on both sides in the Civil War. Well, Pence fails to acknowledge that nearly half of those people fighting, the Confederates, were fighting to maintain slavery, not to end it. Enslaved Black people were freed not because white Confederates liberated them. They were freed because the Union military forces, which included more than 180,000 Black men and women, won the war. Some contend that Blacks already had received reparations in the form of Barack Obama's election as the 44th president of the United States. You had Pence and Senate Majority Leader then Mitch McConnell making this claim at the same time period, even though majority of white Americans voted against Obama, 39% of whites compared with 93% of Blacks and 71% of Latinx. If by Black reparations you mean the elimination of the huge gulf in Black-white wealth, which we do advise, Obama's election, for all of its salutary effects, did not significantly move that needle. You had, again, Mike Pence talking about, Republican policy initiatives with regards to economics and healthcare and energy issues. But in fact, none of this translated into material advantages or full citizenship for Black people. So back to this notion that slavery was not so long ago. We memorialize plantations across the American South. It's a very big business. Wedding destinations, family reunions. All too often the essential Black presence on those plantations is downplayed, or the institution of slavery is described as benign, or that Blacks were delighted by the association. This notion that slavery is not so distant falls away when one looks at the institution from a generational standpoint. We include some stories from one of our favorite consultants, Hortense McClinton, who is the daughter of an enslaved person. So this is a living person. She's what, 104?
She's 104 now.
104 years old now. We spoke to her about 10 days ago on the phone. She had called us to discuss, some of the recent events related to the January 6th congressional hearings. But yes, her father, Seabrone James King, was an infant when slavery ended. So he was born enslaved.
Yeah, he was born in January 1865.
Right.
Yeah.
But she is one of at least 4 people that we learned about over the course of researching From Here to Equality, who were the children of people who were enslaved, including my grandmother, my mother's mother. Another of these 21st century children of enslaved Black Americans is Ruth Odom Bonner, whose father, Elijah Odom, was born enslaved in Mississippi and later would become a physician. His daughter Ruth became active in the civil rights movement in her hometown of Cleveland. We remember her because the Smithsonian Institution and then President Obama and First Lady Michelle Obama invited her and members of their family, 3 generations of their family, to ring the Freedom Bell at the dedication ceremony for the National Museum of African American History and Culture in September 2016. That bell had originally graced Williamsburg, Virginia's first Baptist church, which was founded by Blacks in 1776, quote, in defiance of local law, end quote. But, if we wait long enough, all Black Americans whose parents were enslaved and all who lived through nearly 100 years of racial apartheid in this country will have died. But the atrocities keep coming, and that is why we need a program of reparations for Black Americans.
Yeah, we think that these atrocities are well encapsulated in measures of the devaluation of Black lives. And so there's a section of the book in which we actually attempt to provide numerical estimates of the magnitude of the devaluation of Black lives. So folks in the Black Lives Matter movement could have taken a further step by actually attempting to demonstrate what the measurable values are of the magnitude at which Black lives have been discounted in American society. So let me share again from the text. There are a number of ways in which numerical estimates can be placed on the differential value assigned to Black versus white lives in the United States. For example, as early as the 1840s, New York Life typically insured whites for anywhere from $1,000 to $5,000, while enslaved Blacks typically were insured on behalf of their owners for no more than $400 and sometimes for as little as $200. It has been estimated that in 1928, there was 1 hospital bed for every 139 white Americans, but only 1 for every 1,941 Black Americans, indicating that the average Black life was worth only 7% of the average white life. During the Jim Crow years, when the dual system of schooling operated, the gap in per pupil expenditures provides a powerful index of the magnitude of the discount rate on Black lives. For example, in 1939 to 1940, per pupil expenditures for white students in most of the southern states were 3 times more than they were for Black students, suggesting that a young Black life was worth about 30% of a young white life. In Mississippi, per pupil expenditures were 7 times greater, suggesting that in Mississippi at that time, a young Black life was worth 15% of a young white life. In Alabama in 1912, and Kirsten discovered this, the document with this evidence in it in a California.
Right, the California African American Museum of History, in Los Angeles.
In Los Angeles. So in Alabama in 1912, a cluster of counties spent 32 cents on Black students' education per every $15 spent on white students' education, implying that a white youth's life was deemed to be worth an incredible 4,700% more than a Black youth's life. Today, the estimated difference in spending per Black and white student is reduced substantially, although a 13% gap remains. Unfortunately, the narrowing of the spending gap disguises a profound racial gap in curriculum and instruction in a world of desegregated schools. The disparity in the rate of placement of Black students in gifted and talented programs provides a marked indicator of the devaluation of Black youth in the nation's educational system. Black and Latinx students constitute 40% of America's public school students, but only 26% of the students enrolled in gifted and talented programs. The average Black child is 66% less likely to be referred for gifted math and reading than their white classmates. A final indicator that we discuss of the devaluation of Black lives concerns the rates at which Black men are killed by the police relative to the rates at which white men are killed by the police. And Black men are killed at 3 times the rate of white men in each year, implying once again that Black lives are worth 1/3 of white lives.
Did you want to talk a bit about press release about Black prosperity?
Yes, okay, that's a good suggestion. Yeah, there's maybe you should read this section of the book, but the American public, when we talk about the importance of the racial wealth gap, it's also valuable to note that the American public has no idea how large that gap is. In fact, the American public generally doesn't have any idea how large the disparities are between Blacks and whites. So there are many, many Americans who are walking around on the assumption that either Blacks have caught up with whites or are actually doing better than whites on most of the material indicators that are relevant to the quality of our lives. Yeah.
I think maybe we should try to include some other claims, some other forms of opposition in the interest of time.
Okay.
Okay. So, one of the problems, in addition to the federal government's decision to renege on those 40-acre land grants that were promised to the newly emancipated white people at the end of the Civil War, while simultaneously providing 160-acre land grants to white Americans, including recent immigrants from Europe. So basically, the federal government was investing in the wealth of white Americans while actively de-investing in the wealth of Black people. So not only did the federal government not make good on its promise to give Black people a leg up, to give them a grub stake, to help them along that road to full citizenship, it also did not punish the traitors. It did not punish the rebels. It did not punish the secessionists as initially was expected. And so we want to read a little bit more from our book, from Here Equality, and talk about, what the radical Republicans expected, and indeed what many of the Southerners expected, the defeated South, what they expected in terms of the requirements for them to be readmitted to the Union. So the radicals, we say from Here Equality, in Lincoln's party had no compunction about labeling the rebels as traitors. The radical Republicans were seeking a comprehensive, and this is our term, deconfederatization of the American South. I quote the radicals: abolish everything on the face of the earth but this Union. Free every state, slay every traitor, burn every rebel mansion. If these things be necessary to preserve this temple of freedom to the world and to our posterity. So this was the rallying cry of Thaddeus Stevens. He was the conscience of the radicals. And this is what the argument that he raised during the speech he gave when he won renomination for his congressional seat in 1862. But there have been numerous incidences where, Southern American soldiers, and not just Southerners, Northerners as well, have flown the Confederate flag in the 20th and 21st century battle sites in Vietnam, the Gulf War, Iraq. The flag, until recently was quite ubiquitous in many public places. And some of you may have seen, no small number of individuals who stormed the Capitol on January 6, 2021, carrying Confederate flags and wearing Confederate insignia. So, this is infatuation with the Confederacy is very much with us. And this is very different from what you see in Germany, for example, where it did not happen immediately. Where the government decided that they needed to censor the Nazis and to remove from public spaces the symbols of Nazism. But that hasn't happened here yet. We haven't had a movement to this day to say that this is not who we are as Americans. This is not where our values lie. In fact, our actions, basically say the opposite, that we value the Confederacy, that this lost cause ideology is something that all of us share, which is absolutely not true. But until we have a formal, official, removal of these symbols, when we are no longer talking about these people as patriots, we are no longer memorializing them as heroes, then and only then will we be able to move, in a positive direction in terms of full citizenship for Black American citizens of U.S. slavery.
To conclude our presentation, I think it's important to say that if you can imagine a future, that's an important step on creating that future. And so one of the tasks of our book was to provide a plan for reparations so that we could aid in the process of building that imagined future and bring it into fruition. So we think reparations for Black Americans whose ancestors were enslaved in the United States is achievable. And it is just as important today as it was at the end of the Civil War. And so as a consequence, we'd like to point those of you who are in the audience and other folks who will listen to this podcast in the future to chapter 13 of our book, where we outline how reparations can be done and how reparations should be done. And we'll also like to refer you to the preface for the new paperback edition of the book, where we also present a more compact version of our plan that we discuss in chapter 13, and where we also reject HR 40 as a route to true reparations, and we reject this wave of piecemeal local reparations initiatives, and we put reparations in air quotes here, as a route to true reparations.
So we welcome your questions and comments.
All right, everybody. So Kirsten and William, thank you again for coming. I want to open this opportunity to folks in the audience who have questions. There's one in particular, I believe the brother's name is Craig, who wrote it, and he talked about a skit that, what's the comedian's name? Patrice O'Neill did years ago before he passed away, where he talked about how, Black folks shouldn't have to pay taxes. And maybe that should be a form of reparation. And I remember back in high school, I had a great teacher, Miss Sachs, who taught this multicultural studies course. And we had a debate about this in my class, like how should, reparations occur? And I was like, yo, I don't want to ever pay taxes ever again. And I actually think we had a technology to do it. So I would like to get you all's thoughts on another argument or proposal for, our reparations being that, Black folks maybe not having to pay tax, or the descendants of slaves in the United States not having to pay taxes, I would say in perpetuity.
So that would not be adequate to eliminate the racial wealth gap. And that's because our tax burden, particularly at the federal level, is tied to our income levels. And our income is reduced discriminatorily by the way in which structural racism operates in this society. And there are a significant number of Black people whose incomes are so low they don't have any tax obligation whatsoever. So they would receive absolutely nothing from a reparations scheme of that type.
That's about 40%.
That's right.
40%
That's
of
right.
all Black people don't earn enough to even
pay taxes. So we do think that the monies that people receive under a reparations plan should be tax-free. But we don't think a zero tax policy for Black Americans is a way in which reparations should be delivered.
And Danica Carey has a question about how do you get, I'm gonna quote her directly, okay? She says, it sounds like reparations are tied to the country being an agreement and acknowledgement and a willingness to change. What do you feel are the strongest steps and movements towards getting the country to collectively acknowledge and being willing to change? Or is that even necessary?
No,
Oh, it definitely is
it's
necessary. Definitely is necessary. Black people can't make reparations happen by themselves. If that were the case, it would have already happened.
Right.
We don't have the numbers, but we are encouraged by.
And we don't have the weapons. Oh, I'm sorry.
I didn't say that.
Okay.
We are encouraged by the changes in opinion that that have been evidenced through polling. So in 2000, only 4% of white Americans thought that some kind of monetary payment to Black Americans was reasonable. 4%. About 16 years later, that number had jumped almost to 16%, so almost a percentage point a year. Then the most recent data is like
for this year,
for this current year, we're now looking at what 30.
It's about 30%.
About 30%. So not 100, not a majority, but that's a tremendous increase over 4%. And when you're looking at millennials, you're looking at a little bit over half who think that reparations for Black American descendants of U.S. slavery is a positive thing and it should happen. So we don't have a crystal ball. We don't know what's going to happen in the future, but we are very much encouraged that conversations like this are continuing to happen. We have short attention spans in this country. And yet this conversation has been, ongoing for a number of years.
Since 2019.
Since 2019.
Yeah.
Going strong. There are more people who are trying to wrap their brains around what it is, what it isn't. I can remember when we were not being shouted down by people in the audience. Oh yes. And when people began to say, all right, so let's just say if maybe this were to happen, how would we do it? And we thought, oh, eureka. Now we can talk about process. Now we can talk about a strategy. But there was a long time when people just, didn't want to hear any of this. And who do you think you are? And, take that somewhere else. So we are very much encouraged. And, I think people are also beginning to have a better understanding of our shared history. We certainly have learned a tremendous amount about American history in the process of writing From Here to Equality, and we continue to learn. We're looking now at the 100 plus massacres, White Terror campaign, basically, that took place from Reconstruction through the end of World War II. And these were situations in which, Black people who are exercising the vote and beginning to take public office at every level. And this is at a point when, Black people, for the most part, were registered as Republicans, and they and their white allies were very active. Black people were delighted to be able to participate in American political life in this way. But this is also a point when many of the Democrats, white Southerners especially, who were unwilling to swear an oath of allegiance to the United States, were disenfranchised. And rather than accept that or agree to pledge their fealty, pledge their support to the United States, they said, well, we're gonna handle this another way. And so they began to insult and intimidate and threaten and then murder these Black political operatives and their white allies. And they burned them out. Many people are aware of the Tulsa massacre. a big reason why people are even aware that there was a Black Wall Street in Tulsa is that white people destroyed it. Wilmington, North Carolina, 1898. Tulsa was 1921, is another such place. But there's also Colfax, Louisiana, 1873. Coushatta, Louisiana, 1874. Vicksburg, Mississippi, 1908.
No, 1874 for Vicksburg.
Atlanta, 1906.
1906, yeah.
Fort Bend County, Texas, where my grandfather, my mother's father was from, 1880,
1888,
89.
yeah.
So there've been many of these.
Yeah.
Where, and they often occurred during the run up to an election. So the white supremacists were not, things didn't look good for them on the run up to the election. They said, well, we'll just disperse, the voters. We'll just make sure that, these Black Republicans and their white allies don't get to the poll.
Or in
the case with Wilmington, when they did not manage to do that on the front end, they said, all right, we'll take care of business on the back end. And in places like Fort Bend County, Texas, you had white rule from the point of those massacres for the next 65 years. Yeah. This was the case in Wilmington as well.
Edgefield County, South Carolina, they took over the courthouse and stuffed the ballot box so that there were, 2,700 more votes cast than there were people who were eligible to vote. So people talk about voter fraud. White Democrats in the 19th century were the architects of voter fraud. Now, we should point out, because today's Republicans always are trying to claim that they are the party of righteousness. The parties have flipped. Right. And the party that now is the repository of the spirit of the Confederacy is the Republican Party.
I see D.L. Grant mentioned Slocum, Texas.
Yes.
And so this is a case where Black people were celebrating the victory of Jack Johnson, the boxer, over the Great White Hope, what's his name? James Jeffries. And many white people were just outraged to see Black people celebrating and joyful. And Slocum was one of those places where whites just came in and just slaughtered Black people.
What do they call it?
A pot shot affair.
A pot shot affair.
Yeah. Thanks for that.
So I want to, I think Ashley Adams has a really interesting question. She says, thank you for your work, Kirsten and William.
And Ashley was on another event that I was listening to earlier today, I think. Am I correct? Yes.
Okay. All right. So I'm gonna read Ashley's question. When you say reject local reparations, what does that mean for all of the local reparations efforts that are happening across the country, local commissions that are being established? Given your position, do you have any recommendations for how the federal government could work with state and local efforts? Do you see value in local work at all?
So if these local initiatives, it is a great question. If these local initiatives were properly cast, properly labeled as something like racial equity initiatives or atonement programs, we would definitely, champion them, because these are definitely programs that cities and states need to engage in. But basically, you're talking about projects and undertakings that need to be done anyway. These are things that should have happened. So, cities that are saying we're going to focus on increasing the contracts that go to Black businesses. As an entrepreneur, this is something I imagine that you have been, working on as well. Well, that should have been happening all along. That's not reparations.
And that is not compensation.
And that's not compensation
for the failure to do it.
Right.
Okay. And we have to distinguish between ending a harm and compensating for the effects of the harm. And reparations is compensation for the effects of a harm. And the states and localities don't have the capacity to meet that task. If we estimate that the amount that's required to eliminate the racial wealth gap is 14 to 15 trillion dollars, the combined budgets of all state and local governments are what?
It's about 3.5.
Or it's
trillion.
definitely less than
Less than
$5 trillion. Yeah.
Yeah.
So they
They
don't
don't
have the
to
capacity.
do it.
But also, it's the federal government that's really the culpable party. I mean, Kirsten talked at some length about the failure to provide Black Americans with the 40-acre land grants that they were promised, while at the same time, the federal government was giving 1.5 million white families 160-acre land grants in the Western Territories. She talked about the massacres. Well, one of the artifacts of the massacres was the not just the taking of Black lives, but the appropriation and seizure of Black-owned property. White folks made it their own property, raised their own wealth while they reduced Black wealth. And in the 20th century, the federal government shifts from land distribution as its asset building process or procedure to home ownership. And then it does that in a highly discriminatory fashion. So some people will make the argument, like somebody has made here, that something is better than nothing at all. I think we would disagree that you should not settle for less than you merit. And if you settle for less than you merit, you will never address the fundamental disparities that exist in the society that constrain Black lives and Black opportunity.
I mean, I would say to individuals who are in cities or states that are contemplating these so-called reparations plans, try to get involved early and get them to rename these projects, get them to call them racial equity initiatives, also, and push for, push them as far as you can, focus on mass incarceration, look at health outcomes, look at eminent domain. I mean, that's definitely an issue that is specific, places where, Black people were pushed out of their homes and their neighborhoods so that airports could be built, or convention centers could be built, or performance arts centers could be built, football stadiums, what have you. We're not saying don't push those cases. We're saying that is a separate activity from true reparations. And we see no reason why you can't do both. Focus locally, but also focus federally.
Yeah,
and these local groups could also make as part of their recommendations after they've dealt with all these other, areas of concern that we've talked about. While they're doing that, also say, and we support a federal program of true reparations for Black American descendants of U.S. slavery. I wanted to say, Sandy mentioned that through the Homestead Act, 1.5 million white households benefited from that single federal policy. That translates to 45 million current living white Americans who are benefiting from this single free equity program. It's like, getting a dividend check from the government every month. So we know that 25% of all white households have a wealth position of $1 million. 25% of all white households, 1 million, and only 4% of Blacks. So, the federal government created this racial wealth gap, and it maintains it to the advantage of white Americans. So, we're not saying no, step back and take nothing, but we're saying don't just, can we just have a nomenclature, conversation and call these, in some cases, like the Evanston, Illinois situation. That's some of you may be aware of their housing voucher program. That's masquerading as reparations. Just call it a housing voucher program, and expand it. I think at the moment the ceiling for those $25,000 grants is $10 million. Push that to the limit. Get it increased tenfold, but don't call it reparations.
Yeah, I think our fear is that if we have this array of piecemeal programs, which intrinsically will fall far short of the objective of closing the racial wealth gap, that people will ultimately say, particularly those who are opposed to reparations, will say, well, there's no need for a federal program because you've already got it. And what you will have is something that's wholly inadequate.
Yeah.
So, yeah, why don't the states and localities where there are communities that are very committed to the idea of reparations engage in the project of fighting for the national program? I would also add that there are limitations to individuals and organizations and corporations attempting to meet the bill also. Here's the number that we like to throw out to try to clarify this point. If generous donors put $1 billion into a fund on a monthly basis for reparations, it would take a millennium to get to $14 trillion.
And that's why we say the federal government has both the capacity, and only the federal government has the capacity
to do this.
Yeah.
to do it.
Yeah. I wanna highlight one person's argument in the chat. I don't think we got to it. And Adrian is mentioning taxation could be a way to solve the issue. I don't want to focus on that part, but he says everyone that is a Black descendant. And so I don't know if Adrian, he or she, means everyone who's a Black descendant, period, or just those of us who are the descendants of American slaves. So can y'all talk about maybe some of the tensions that you've maybe or maybe didn't encounter between, like, yo, all Black people should get it, or just the Black folks who were here who are the descendants of those who were enslaved and built the Americas and things like that?
So, we believe absolutely that Black people in this country have a claim to make, but all Black Americans' claims should not be laid at the feet of the U.S. federal government. So our thinking is, if you or your ancestors were part of, let me put it this way: if your ancestors were enslaved or colonized by, back up, let's say your origins are from the Caribbean, from Trinidad, from Antigua, from Jamaica, then your claim should go to the UK. If you're from Haiti, the claim should go to France, which is somewhat complicated because Haiti was made to pay reparations to France. And so that money should be given back to Haiti with interest, and they should be paid reparations. So, we find it we in our research looking at other reparations organizations, we have become aware of CARICOM, which is an organization that is fighting for reparations for people of Caribbean descent. And CARICOM does not include in its reparations claims Black American descendants of U.S. slavery, nor should they. But the reverse is also true. We have different histories. And we're talking about the people whose ancestors were denied those 40-acre land grants in the United States.
The freedmen.
The freedmen. We're talking about the folks whose ancestors, and not just ancestors, and are both part of this, the folks who lived through nearly 100 years of Jim Crow and white terror campaigns in this country. Yes, certainly there are atrocities that folks from other parts of diaspora lived through, and we salute them. I think there's a lot we can learn from each other. But again, we believe that there is a problem when you're trying to lump all these groups together. Yeah. When we look at the successful reparations claims, they have been focused on very specific communities. When you think about the Japanese Americans who were unlawfully interned during World War II, initially they were focused on all of the Japanese people of Japanese descent, Japanese Americans who were of Japanese descent who had been interned. So not just in the US, but also in Central and South America. But as they got closer to a resolution, they realized that that was not going to fly. And the hope was that they could engage those other folks who had also been interned at some later point, which they did do. But the initial push, the initial redress was only possible because they had focused on Japanese Americans. It's interesting when you look at the reparations that were paid to victims of the Holocaust. When you look even at Japanese Americans, people didn't say, oh, well, what about Black people from the Caribbean? What about the Native Americans?
What about Black Americans?
What about
from
Black
United
Americans from the United States?
No, nobody said
Nobody
that.
said that. So, why is it when the potential beneficiaries are Black Americans of U.S. slavery, we have all these groups saying, oh, wait, you have to include all these other groups, as well, and at the same time, and in the same movement. So we would say,
there's the word I'd like to insert here is there's a certain respect that we have to give, a certain degree of dignity to particular claims. And we should not conflate them with claims that might be relevant to other communities' experiences.
So we are getting close to time. I do want to get to this one question before I ask the final question. And I think Fritz has a really good question. Fritz is wondering, what are some sources that you all can talk about, that you all can suggest for people to continue their education about reparations and how we might go about doing that, or just more information in general about reparations for Black Americans?
Well, I think that there's the selfish answer is, please read our book and the new book that's forthcoming that's called the Black Reparations Project, which is an edited volume coming from the University of California Press in May. But there's a host of works that are really pertinent to this subject. In terms of the work that we've been doing on the massacres, James Lowen's book, Sundown Towns, is excellent. Mirza Baradaran's book on the history of Black banks and on the so-called Black capitalism movement is excellent.
an older book, I'd say W.E.B. Du Bois's Black Reconstruction is essential.
Yeah. And then, of course, what's the book, The Debt?
The Debt, yes.
Yeah. And now I'm gonna lose the author's name, even though he's really famous.
Keep talking.
Kirsten's gonna see if she can find it on the source of all information. There's a lot of literature. I will say that there's an article that we did that may be very helpful to folks, that is in the spring 2022 issue of the Journal of Economic Perspectives. And it's called The Cumulative Cost of Racism. And it's our attempt to critically survey different ways in which people have tried to measure what the amount of a reparations bill should be. And I think there's some important philosophical issues that we try to tackle there. But that might be helpful to folks also.
And that's Randall Robinson.
Randall Robinson,
Yeah, it looks like Fritz is already an expert, because they put Randall Robinson in the chat before y'all can even find
Thank you.
And I will say, there was a paper that I mentioned that was in the American Economic Papers and Proceedings that I wrote with Dania Frank that was published in 2003, and it was called The Economics of Reparations. But the first paper that I'm aware of, written by an economist on Black reparations, was a paper that was published in the same journal in the mid-1970s by Robert Brown, B-R-O-W-N-E. And I recommend that people look at that. It's quite good and inspiring in certain ways.
So real quick, I want to thank Kirsten and William for coming today. I appreciate you all taking the time to be here with us. Those of you who are still typing in the chat, y'all got questions. Look, I'm going to tell you, a lot of the answers to the questions that you all have are in the book. So get the book, check it out. And even some of the critiques that I saw about how do we get the $14 trillion and whatnot, $1.4 trillion allocated to African Americans, Black Americans. Those answers are in the book, so be sure to check that out. And yeah, before you all leave, those of you in the audience, give me a moment to share what we're going to be talking about the next time we have this podcast discussion. And Kirsten and William, if y'all have any last words that you want to share with the audience, please share.
Well, I would say, don't forget that you have, agency, that you have power yourselves as individuals and as members of formal and informal groups, and that you can write letters to your elected officials at every level, from the city on up to the president, and let them know your thoughts about this. Let them know that you understand that there are many, many piecemeal and half a loaf programs that are masquerading as reparations, but that what you understand as reparations is a project that's going to eliminate the racial wealth gap, and that's what's really important to you, and that you vote. But that's something that an individual could do, but you could also connect with your book club, with your artisanal beer collective, your ultimate frisbee group. All of these entities have agency and have the ability to come together and talk about these issues and kind of figure out what you all what you all understand, what you are trying to what you want to learn, and sharing your understanding, but also being active. And our city council under the previous mayor unanimously passed a resolution in support of a true reparations program, a federal program. And they also talked about some of the resolution speaks to some of the problems with HR 40. And I would say to folks, read HR 40. There's so many people who talk about HR 40 who have not read it.
Right.
And HR 40 is really problematic. But because it's the only piece of legislation we have, basically, it comes off negatively if you say I'm against HR 40. But we're for reparations, but we're not pro HR 40.
Yeah,
Okay.
and Kirsten, I mean, you wrote a very, very fine op-ed piece on HR 40 that's in Bloomberg. It was published about a year ago, maybe. Yeah,
Not a year ago.
and so I'd encourage people to take a look at that. And also, my last point, Kirsten did a great article on Queen Mother Audley Moore that's in a recent issue of Vanity Fair. And I would say people that it's not only valuable from an information standpoint, but it's entertaining. And so
Okay.
It's in the November issue.
Yeah, so
Vanity
please
Fair.
take a look at
Amazing.
that too.
And we will check that out. So all of you who are asking questions about the books and the sources that they said, I promise you what I'm gonna try to do by the end of the weekend is listen to the recording, and I'll write them down and I'll send it to everybody in an email. And Kirsten and William, again, thank you for coming. Everyone else, please stay. Let me tell you about what we have coming up in the next few months for Entrepreneurial Appetite that you all can join in person or virtually. And so Kirsten and William, if y'all want to leave now, you can. We appreciate you coming.
Good
Thank
night.
you.
I'm going to
Thanks
share
for
my
having us.
screen
Wish you all the best.
with the audience. So my brothers, both my brothers are here. My brother Devin Clark, thank you for being here, and Marshawn Grays are with us. I'm going to ask Marshawn to type in the chat again the link to one of the next events that we have coming up as I share my screen and tell you a little bit about what we have coming here in the future. And so in April, I am partnering with the San Antonio African American Community Archive and Museum, known as SACAM, to host a book discussion about The Alamo, A Cradle of Lies, Slavery, and White Supremacy, written by Mario Salas, who is a scholar here in the San Antonio community who is Afro-Latino and does a lot of work about the local history here in San Antonio. And so, as you all can see in the chat, I think my brother Marshawn put it in there. You can go to that link, you can register. It's a little different than our typical registration process because I am partnering with SACAM. And as I mentioned before, for those of you who are coming a little bit later, part of the mission of this platform, Entrepreneurial Appetite, is to build community, promote intellectualism, and support Black businesses. And when I think about Black businesses, I think about that expansively. And so SACAM is one of the newest Black history museums in the country. I think it's only been around since 2015. And so this is, 2018. And this is one of my efforts to support the good work that's happening there. And so there will be a virtual option for $15 for those of you who are other places in the country to join and watch that virtually. But we also have an in-person option for those of you who are here locally in Texas and San Antonio, surrounding regions, who want to come down. It's $65, but you get a copy of the book, and there will be refreshments with that as well. Also want to make you all aware that later on in March, we're going to have a conversation with Mia Bay, who is the author of Traveling Black, A Story of Race and Resistance. And I'm going to try my best to partner with my homeboy Leroy Adams, who is the founder of the Buddy Pass magazine, which is a new magazine that highlights and recognizes Black folks who travel across the United States, but then also around the world. And so we're going to be presenting some really cool stuff here coming up this spring, and we will continue to partner with Black institutions and businesses and organizations. And so for those of you who want to be ongoing supporters of Entrepreneurial Appetite, one of the things that we're trying to do is hire a Black intern to help us with the production of the show. That includes the live production, but also the podcast, which you can get on all your podcast platforms, Entrepreneurial Appetite. And as a patron, you get access to our monthly conversations, but the money from that will go to hire, like I said, a Black-owned intern. And as you all know, or maybe don't know, students in our community oftentimes don't have the opportunities to get internships in the same way. And so we want to start getting these students opportunities their freshman year so they can build some skills and put some things on their resume. So again, I thank you all for joining us. If you have any questions or concerns, or you want to find out other ways to support, feel free to email me or hit me up on LinkedIn at Langston Clark. And one more time, I thank all of you for joining us here this evening.